All right. Hey, everyone. Hope everyone had a fantastic Tuesday. It is definitely a good start to the week. Second start of the week, because start was... Anyways, reading Conan tonight. So here we are. This is the Scarlet Citadel, the second published Conan story, which is sort of a soft sequel to the first one, although it's not a direct connection between them. It's just the period of King Conan in his later years instead of adventuring Conan. But he gets up to adventure in this one too. My plan is to read the first 3 parts, and then Thursday I'll read the 5th and 6th parts. To break it up in that way, I cannot die from reading so much at once. Alright, so let's get going. The Scarlet Citadel, excuse me, by Robert E. Howard. Part 1. They trapped the lion on Shamus's plain. Shamus? Shamus? There's an apostrophe there, so it's Shamu. Weird. On Shamu's plain, they weighted his limbs with an iron chain. They cried aloud in trumpet blast. They cried, "The lion is caged at last. Woe to the cities of Reverend Plain, if ever the lion stalks again." One weird thing about Robert E. Howard is that he's a poetry nerd, and he likes his little poems in the beginning of parts in his stories. Another weird thing about Robert E. Howard is that sometimes it feels like he was paid by the adjective, which I guess fair enough because he was writing this during in the 30s in the Great Depression, so fuck it. Anyways, the roar of battle had died away. The shouts of victory mingled with the cries of the dying. Like gay-hued leaves after an autumn storm, the fallen littered the plain. The sinking sun shimmered on burnished helmets, gilt-worked mail, silver breastplates, broken swords, and heavy regal folds of silken standards, overthrown in pools of curdling crimson. In silent heaps lay war horses and their steel-clad riders, flowing manes and blowing plumes, stained alike in the red tide. About them and among them, like the drift of a storm, were strewn slashed and trampled bodies, and steel caps and leather jerkins, archers and pikemen. The elephants sounded a fanfare of triumph all over the plain, and the hoofs of the victors crunched in the breasts of the vanquished, as all the straggling, shining lines converged inward like the spokes of a glittering wheel, to the spot where the last survivor still waged unequal strife. That day Conan, king of Aquilonia, had seen the pick of his chivalry cut to pieces, smashed and hammered to bits, and swept into eternity. With 5,000 knights, he had crossed the southeastern border of Aquilonia and ridden into the grassy meadowlands of Ophir to find his former ally, King Amalrus of Ophir. Amalrus of Ophir, drawn up against him with the hosts of Brabonus, king of Koth. Too late had he seen the trap. These names, man. All that a man might do he had done with his 5,000 cavalrymen against 30,000 knights, archers, and spearmen of the conspirators. Without bowmen or infantry, he had hurled his armored horsemen against the oncoming host, had seen the knights of his foes in their shining mail go down before his lances, had torn the opposing center to bits, driving the riven ranks headlong before him, only to find himself caught in a vice as the untouched wings closed in. Strabonus's Shemetish bowmen had wrought havoc among his knights, feathering them with shafts that found every crevice in their armor, shooting down their horses, the Kothian pikemen rushing in to spear the fallen riders. The mailed lancers of the routed center had reformed, reinforced by the riders from their wings, and had charged again and again, sweeping the field by sheer weight of numbers. The Aquilonians had not fled. They had died on the field, and of the 5,000 knights who had followed Conan southward, not one left the field alive. And now the king himself stood at bay among the slashed bodies of his house troops, his back against a heap of dead horses and men. Ophirian knights. Ophirine? Ophirian knights in gilded mail leaped their horses over mounds of corpses to slash at the solitary figure. Squat Shemites with blue-black beards and dark-faced Kothian knights ringed him on foot. The clangor of steel rose deafeningly. The black-mailed figure of the Western King loomed among his swarming foes, dealing blows like a butcher wielding a great cleaver. Riderless horses raced down the field. About his ironclad feet grew a ring of mangled corpses. His attackers drew back from his desperate savagery, panting and livid. Out through the yelling, cursing lines rode the lords of the conquerors. Strabonus, with his broad dark face and crafty eyes. Amalrus, slender, fastidious, treacherous, dangerous as a cobra. Adjectives, he was paid by him. And the lean vulture, Sothalanti. That sounds right. Clad only in silken robes, his great black eyes glittering from a face that was like that of a bird of prey. Of this Kothian wizard, dark tales were told. Tousle-hooded women in northern and western villages frightened children with his name, and rebellious slaves were brought to a base submission quicker than by the lash, with the threat of being sold to him. Men said that he had a whole library of dark works bound in skin flayed from living human victims, and that in nameless pits below the hill whereon his palace sat, he trafficked with powers of darkness, trading screaming girl slaves for unholy secrets. He was the real ruler of Koth. Now he grinned bleakly as the kings reined back a safe distance from the grim ironclad figure looming among the dead. Before the savage blue eyes, blazing murderously from beneath the crested, dented helmet, the boldest shrank. Conan's dark, scarred face was darker yet with passion. His black armor was hacked to tatters and splashed with blood. His great sword red to the crosspiece. In this stress, all the veneer of civilization had faded. It was a barbarian who faced his conquerors. Conan was a Cimmerian by birth, one of those fierce, moody hillmen who dwelt in their gloomy, clouded land in the north. His saga, which had led him to the throne of Aquilonia, was the basis of a whole cycle of hero tales. So now the kings kept their distance, and Strabonus called on his Shemitish archers to loose their arrows at this foe from a distance. Captains had fallen like ripe grain before the Cimmerian's broadsword, and Strabonus, penurious of his knights as of his coins, was frothing with fury. But Sotha shook his head. Take him alive. Easy to say, snarled Strabonus, uneasy, lest in some way the black-mailed giant might hew a path to them through the spears. Who can take a man-eating tiger alive? By Ishtar, his heel is on the necks of my finest swordsmen. It took 7 years and stacks of gold to train each, and there they lie, so much kite's meat. Arrows, I say. Again, nay, snapped Sotha, swinging down from his horse. He laughed coldly. Have you not learned by this time that my brain is mightier than any sword? He passed through the lines of pikemen, and the giants in their steel caps and mail brigandines shrank back fearfully, lest they so much as touched the skirts of his robe. Nor were the plumed knights slower in making room for him. He stepped over the corpses and came face to face with the grim king. The host watched in tense silence, holding their breath. The black-armored figure loomed in terrible menace over the lean, silk-robed shaped, the notch-dripping sword hovering on high. I offer you life, Conan, said Sotha, a cruel mirth bubbling at the back of his voice. I give you death, wizard, snarled the king, and backed by iron muscles and ferocious hate, the greatsword swung in a stroke meant to shear Sotha's lean torso in half. But even as the host cried out, the wizard stepped in, too quick for the eye to follow, and apparently merely laid an open hand on Conan's left forearm, from the ridged muscles of which the mail had been hacked away. The whistling blade veered from its arc, and the male giant crashed heavily to the earth to lie motionless. Sotha laughed silently. Take him up and fear not. The lion's fangs are drawn. The kings reined in and gazed in awe at the fallen lion. Conan lay stiffly, like a dead man, but his eyes glared up at them, wide open and blazing with helpless fury. What have you done to him? Asked Amalris uneasily. Sotha displayed a broad ring of curious design on his finger. He pressed his fingers together, and on the inner side of the ring, a tiny steel fang darted out like a fang's tongue. It is steeped in the juice of the purple lotus, which grows in the ghost-haunted swamps of southern Stygia, said the magician. Its touch produces temporary paralysis. Put him in chains and lay him in a chariot. The sun sets, and it's time we were on the road to... Horshamish. Alright. Strabonus turned to his general, Arbanus. Urbanus. We return to Korshemesh with the wounded. Only a troop of the royal cavalry will accompany us. Your orders are to march at dawn to the Aquilonian border and invest the city of Shamar. The Ophirians will supply you with food along the march. We will rejoin you as soon as possible with reinforcements. So the host, with its steel-sheathed knights, its pikemen and archers and camp servants, went into camp in the meadowlands near the battlefield. And through the starry night, the two kings and the sorcerer, who was greater than any king, rode to the capital of Strabonus, in the midst of the glittering palace troop, and accompanied by a long line of chariots loaded with the wounded. In one of these chariots lay Conan, king of Aquilonia. Excuse me. King of Aquilonia, weighted with chains, the tang of defeat in his mouth, the blind fury of a trapped tiger in his soul. The poison which had frozen his mighty limbs to helplessness had not paralyzed his brain. As the chariot in which he lay rumbled over the Meadowlands, his mind revolved maddeningly about his defeat. Amalris had sent an emissary imploring aid against Strabonus, who he said was ravaging his western domain, which lay like a tapering wedge between the border of Aquilonia and the vast southern kingdom of Koth. He asked only 1,000 horsemen in the presence of Conan to harden his demoralized subjects. Conan now mentally blasphemed. In his generosity, he had come with 5 times the number the treacherous monarch had asked. In good faith, he had ridden into Ophir, and had been confronted by the supposed rivals allied against him. It spoke significantly of his prowess that they had brought up a whole host to trap him and his 5,000. A red cloud veiled his vision, his veins swelled with fury, and in his temples a pulse throbbed maddeningly. In all his life, he had never known greater and more helpless wrath. In swift-moving scenes, the pageant of his life passed fleetingly before his mental eye. A panorama, wherein moved shadowy figures which were himself, in many guises and conditions. A skin-clad barbarian, a mercenary swordsman in horned helmet and scale-mail corslet, a corsair in dragon-proud galley that trailed a crimson wake of blood and pillage along southern coasts, a captain of hosts in burnished steel on a rearing black charger, a king on a golden throne with the lion banner flowing above, and throngs of gay-hued courtiers and ladies on their knees. But always the jouncing and rumbling of the chariot brought his thoughts back to revolve with maddening monotony about the treachery of Amalris and the sorcery of Sotha. The veins nearly burst in his temples, and cries of the wounded in the chariots filled him with ferocious satisfaction. What a dickhead. Before midnight, they crossed the Ophirian border, and at dawn the spires of Korshemesh stood up, gleaming and rose-tinted on the southeastern horizon. The slim towers overawed by the grim Scarlet Citadel that at the distance was like a splash of bright blood on the sky. That was the castle of Sotha. Only one narrow street, paved with marble and guarded by heavy iron gates, led up to it, where it crowned the hill dominating the city. The sides of that hill were too sheer to be climbed elsewhere. From the walls of the citadel, one could look down on the broad white streets of the city, on minareted mosques, shops, temples, mansions, and markets. One could look down, too, on the palaces of the king, set in broad gardens, high-walled, luxurious riots of fruit trees and blossoms, through which artificial streams murmured, and silvery fountains rippled incessantly. Over all brooded the citadel, like a condor stooping above its prey, intent on its own dark meditations. The mighty gates between the huge towers of the outer wall clanged open, and the king rode into his capital between lines of glittering spearmen, while 50 trumpets pealed salute. But no throng swarmed the white-paved streets to fling roses before the conqueror's hoofs. Strabonus had raced ahead of news of the battle, and the people just rousing to the occupations of the day gaped to see their king returning with a small retinue, and were in doubt as to whether it portended victory or defeat. Conan, life sluggishly moving in his veins again, craned his neck from the chariot floor to view the wonders of the city, which men called the Queen of the South. He had thought to ride some day to these golden chased gates at the head of his steel-clad squadrons, with the great lion banner flowing over his helmeted head. Instead, he entered in chains, stripped of his armor, and thrown like a captive slave on the bronze floor of his conqueror's chariot. A wayward devilish mirth of mockery rose above his fury, but to the nervous soldiers who drove the chariot, his laughter sounded like the muttering of a rousing lion. That's a pretty awesome start to a Conan story, which is an ironic start because you always think of Conan as being the conquering barbarian, always getting the better of everyone else, but he starts on the back foot this time. Which is a good change of pace in hindsight. And also interesting because it's one of the earlier stories. Excuse me. Now, part 2. Gleaming shell of an outworn lie, fable of right divine. You gained your crowns by heritage, but blood was the price of mine. The throne that I won by blood and sweat, by cromb I will not sell. For promise of valleys filled with gold, or threats of halls of hell. Don't know why that sentence was hard to read. The Road of Kings. In the Citadel, in a chamber with a dome ceiling of carven jet, in the fretted arches of doorways glimmering with strange dark jewels, a strange conclave came to pass. Conan of Aquilonia, blood from unbandaged wounds caking his huge limbs, faced his captors. On either side of him stood a dozen black giants, grasping their long-shafted axes. In front of him stood Sotha, and on Devon's lounge Strabonus and Amalrus, in their silks and gold, gleaming with jewels, naked slave boys beside them pouring wine into cups carved of a single sapphire. In strong contrast stood Conan, grim blood-stained, naked but for a loincloth, shackles on his mighty limbs, his blue eyes blazing beneath the tangle of black mane which fell over his low, broad forehead. He dominated the scene, turning to tinsel the pomp of the conquerors by the sheer vitality of his elemental personality. And the kings in their pride and splendor were aware of it each in his secret heart, and were not at ease. Only Sotha was not disturbed. Our desires are quickly spoken, King of Aquilonia, said Sotha. It is our wish to extend our empire. And so you want to seize my kingdom, rasped Conan. What are you but an adventurer, seizing a crown to which you had no more claim than any other wandering barbarian, parried Amalrus. We are prepared to offer you suitable compensation. Compensation! It was a gust of deep laughter from Conan's mighty chest. The price of infamy and treachery. I am a barbarian, so I shall sell my kingdom and its people for life in your filthy goad. Ha! How dare you come to your crown? Or how did you come to your crown, you and that black-faced pig beside you? Your fathers did the fighting and the suffering, and handed their crowns to you on golden platters. What you inherited, without lifting a finger, except to poison a few brothers, I fought for. You sit on satin and guzzle the wine the people sweat for, and talk of divine rights and sovereignty. Bah! I climbed out of the abyss of naked barbarism to the throne, and down in that climb I spilt my blood as freely as I spilt that of others. If either of us has the right to rule men, by Crom it is I. How have you proved yourselves my superiors? I found Aquilonia in the grip of a pig like you, one who traced his genealogy for 1,000 years. The land was torn with the wars of the barons, and the people cried out under oppression and taxation. Today, no Aquilonian noble dares maltreat the humblest of my subjects, and the taxes of the people are lighter than anywhere else in the world. What of you? Your brother Omaurus holds the eastern half of your kingdom and defies you. And you, Strabonus, your soldiers are even now besieging castles of a dozen or more rebellious barons. The people of both your kingdoms are crushed into the earth by tyrannous taxes and levies. And you will loot mine. Ha! Free my hands, and I'll varnish this floor with your brains. Sotha grinned bleakly to see the rage of his kingly companions. All this, truthful though it be, is besides the point. Our plans are no concern of yours. Your responsibility is at an end. When you sign this parchment, which is an abdication in favor of Prince Arpello of Pelia, we will give you arms and horse, and 5,000 golden lunas, and escort you to the eastern frontier. Setting me adrift where I was when I rode into Aquilonia to take service in our armies, except with the added burden of a traitor's name. Conan's laugh was like the deep, short bark of a timber wolf. Arpello, eh? I've had suspicions of that butcher of Pelia. Can you not even steal and pillage frankly and honestly, but you must also have an excuse, however thin? Arpello claims a trace of royal blood, so use him as an excuse for theft, and a satrap to rule through. I'll see you in hell first. You're a fool, exclaimed Amaurus. You are in our hands, and we can take both crown and life at our pleasure. Conan's answer was neither kingly nor dignified, but characteristically instinctive in the man, whose barbaric nature had never been submerged in his adopted culture. He spat full in Amaurus's eye. The king of Ophir leaped up with a scream of outraged fury, groping for his slender sword. Drawing it, he rushed at the Cimmerian, but Sotha intervened. Wait, your majesty. This man is my prisoner. Aside, wizard! Shrieked Amaurus, maddened by the glare in the Cimmerian's blue eyes. Back, I say! Roared Sotha, roused to awesome wrath. His lean hand came from his wide sleeve and cast a shower of dust into the Ophirian's contorted face. Amaurus cried out and staggered back, clutching at his eyes, the sword falling from his hand. He dropped limply on the divan, while the Kothian guards looked on stolidly. And King Strabonus hurriedly gulped another goblet of wine, holding it with hands that trembled. Amaurus lowered his hands and shook his head violently, intelligence slowly sifting back into his gray eyes. I went blind, he growled. What did you do to me, wizard? Merely a gesture to convince you who was the real master, snapped Sotha. The mask of his formal pretense dropped, revealing the naked evil personality of the man. Strabonus has learned his lesson. Let you learn yours. It was but a dust I found in a Stygian tomb which I flung into your eyes. If I brush out their sight again, I will leave you to grope in darkness for the rest of your life. Amaurus shrugged his shoulders, smiled whimsically, and reached for a goblet, dissembling his fear and fury. Polished diplomat, he was quick to regain his poise. Sotha turned to Conan, who had stood imperturbably during the episode. Sometimes he's paid by the letters, not even the adjectives. At the wizard's gesture, the blacks laid hold of their prisoner and marched him behind Sotha, who led the way out of the chamber through an arched doorway into a winding corridor, whose floor was of many-hued mosaics, whose walls were inlaid with gold tissue and silver chasing, and from whose fretted arched ceiling swung golden censers, filling the corridor with dreamy perfumed clouds. They turned down a smaller corridor, done in jet and black jade, gloomy and awful, which ended at a brass door, over whose arch a human skull grinned horrifically. At this door stood a fat, repellent figure, dangling a bunch of keys. Sotha's chief eunuch, Shukeli, all these names, man, of whom grisly tales were whispered, a man with whom a bestial lust for torture took the place of normal human passions. The brass door led on to a narrow stair that seemed to wind down into the very bowels of the hill on which the citadel stood. Down these stairs went the band, to halt at last at an iron door, the strength of which seemed unnecessary. Evidently, it did not open on outer air, yet it was built as if to withstand the battering of mangalos and rams. Shukeli opened it, and as he swung back the ponderous portal, Conan noted the evident uneasiness among the black giants who guarded him. Nor did Shukeli seem altogether devoid of nervousness as he peered into the darkness beyond. Inside the great door, there was a second barrier, composed of heavy steel bars. It was fastened by an ingenious bolt which had no lock and could be worked only from the outside. This bolt shocked back. The grill slammed into the wall. They passed through into a broad corridor, the floor, walls, and arched ceiling of which seemed to be cut out of solid stone. Conan knew he was far underground, even below the hill itself. The darkness pressed in on the guardsmen torches like a sentient, animate thing. They made the king fast to a ring in the stone wall. Above his head in a niche in the wall, they placed a torch, so that he stood in a dim semicircle of light. The blacks were anxious to be gone. They muttered among themselves and cast fearful glances at the darkness. Sotha motioned them out, and they filed through the door in stumbling haste, as if fearing that the darkness might take tangible form and spring upon their backs. Sotha turned towards Conan, and the king noticed uneasily that the wizard's eyes shone in the semi-darkness, and that his teeth much resembled the fangs of a wolf, gleaming whitely in the shadows. "And so, farewell, barbarian," mocked the sorcerer. "I must ride to Shamar in the siege. In 10 days I will be in your palace in Tamar with my warriors. What word from you shall I say to your women before I flay their dainty skins for scrolls whereon to chronicle the triumphs of Sothalanti?" Conan answered with a searing Cimmerian curse that would have burst the eardrums of an ordinary man, and Sotha laughed thinly and withdrew. Conan had a glimpse of his vulture-like figure through the thick-set bars. As he slid home the grate, then the heavy outer door clanged, and silence fell like a pall. Part 3. The lion strode through the halls of hell. Across his path grim shadows fell. Of many moving, nameless shape, monsters with dripping jaws agape. The darkness shuttled with screams and yell, when the lion stalked through the halls of hell. King Conan tested the ring in the wall, and the chain that bound him. His limbs were free, but he knew that his shackles were beyond even his iron strength. The links of the chain were as thick as his thumb, and were fastened to a band of steel about his waist, a band broad as his hand and half an inch thick. The sheer weight of his shackles would have slain a lesser man with exhaustion. The locks that held band and chain were massive affairs that a sledgehammer could hardly have dented. As for the ring, evidently it went clear through the wall and was clenched on the other side. Conan cursed, and panic surged through him as he glared into the darkness that pressed against the half-circle of light. All that superstitious dread of the barbarian slipped in his soul, untouched by civilized logic. His primitive imagination peopled the subterranean darkness with grisly shapes. Besides, his reason told him that he had not been placed there merely for confinement. His captors had no reason to spare him. He had been placed in these pits for a definite doom. He cursed himself for his refusal of their offer, even while his stubborn manhood excuse me. Even while his stubborn manhood revolted at the thought. And he knew that were he taken forth and given another chance. My brain just has trouble parsing these sentences. I don't know if it's just like the style of writing back then, or specifically Robert E. Howard style, or just the way these narrow paragraphs are when reading, but hard for me to parse sometimes. Where was I? And he knew that were he taken forth and given another chance, his reply would be the same. He would not sell his subjects to the butcher. and yet it had been no thought of anyone's gain but his own that he had seized the kingdom originally. Thus, subtly, does the instinct of sovereign responsibility enter even a red-handed plunderer sometimes. Conan thought of Sotha's last abominable threat and groaned in sick fury, knowing it was no idle boast. Men and women were to the wizard no more than the writhing insect is to the scientist. Soft white hands that had caressed him, red lips that had been pressed to his, dainty white bosoms that had quivered to his hot, fierce kisses, to be stripped of their delicate skin, white as ivory and pink as young petals. From Conan's lips burst a yell so frightful and inhuman in its mad fury that a listener would have stared in horror to know that it came from a human throat. The shuddering echoes made him start and brought back his own situation vividly to the king. He glared fearsomely at the outer gloom and thought of grisly tales he had heard of Sotha's necromantic cruelty, and it was with an icy sensation down his spine that he realized that these must be the very halls of horror named in shuddering legendary, the tunnels and dungeons wherein Sotha performed horrible experiments with beings human, bestial, and, it whispered, demoniac. I think he meant demonic. Demoniac, tampering blasphemously with the naked, basic elements of life itself. Rumor said that the mad poet Ronaldo had visited these pits and had been shown horrors by the wizard, and that the nameless monstrosities of which he hinted in his awful poem, The Song of the Pit, were no mere fantasies of a disordered brain. That brain had crashed to dust beneath Conan's battle axe on the night the king had fought for his life with a That brain had crashed to dust beneath Conan's battle axe on the night the king had fought for his life with the assassins the mad rhymer had led into the betrayed palace. But the shuddersome words of that grisly song still rang in the king's ears as he stood there in his chains. Even with the thought, the Cimmerian was frozen by a soft rustling sound, blood freezing in its implication. He tensed in an attitude of listening, painful in its intensity. An icy hand stroked his spine. It was the unmistakable sound of pliant scales slithering softly over stone. Cold sweat beaded his skin, as beyond the ring of dim light he saw a vague and colossal form, awful even in its indistinctness. Hard word to say. It reared upright, swaying slightly, and yellow eyes burned icily on him from the shadows. Slowly, a huge, hideous, wedge-shaped head took form before his dilated eyes, and from the darkness oozed in flowing, scaly coils the ultimate horror of reptilian development. It was a snake that dwarfed all Conan's previous ideas of snakes. 80 feet, it stretched from its pointed tail to its triangular head, which was bigger than that of a horse. In the dim light, its scales glistened coldly, white as hoarfrost. Surely, this reptile was one born and grown in darkness, yet its eyes were full of evil and sure sight. It looped its tightened coils in front of the captive, and the great head of the arching neck swayed a matter of inches from his face. Its forked tongue almost brushed his lips as it darted in and out, and its fetid odor made his senses reel with nausea. The great yellow eyes burned into his, and Conan gave back the glare of a trapped wolf. He fought against the mad impulse to grasp the great arching neck in his tearing hands. Strong beyond the comprehension of a civilized man, he had broken the neck of a python in a fiendish battle on the Stygian coast in his corsair days. But this reptile was venomous. He saw the great fangs, a foot long, curved like scimitars. From them dripped a colorless liquid that he instinctively knew was death. He might conceivably crush that wedge-shaped skull with a desperate clenched fist, but he knew that at its first hint of movement, the monster would strike like lightning. It was not because of any logical reasoning process that Conan remained motionless, since reason might have told him, since he was doomed anyway, to goad the snake into striking and get it over with. It was a blind black instinct of self-preservation that held him rigid as the statue blasted out of iron. Now the great barrel reared up, and the head was poised high above his own as the monster investigated the torch. A drop of venom fell on his naked thigh, and the feel of it was like a white-hot dagger driven into his flesh. Red jets of agony shot through Conan's brain, yet he held himself immovable. Not by the twitching of a muscle or the flicker of an eyelash did he betray the pain of the hurt that left a scar he bore to the day of his death. The serpent swayed above him, as if seeking to ascertain whether there were in truth life in this figure that stood so death-like still. Then suddenly, unexpectedly, the outer door, all but invisible in the shadows, clanged stridently. The serpent, suspicious as all its kind, whipped about with a quickness incredible for its bulk, and vanished with a long-drawn slithering down the corridor. The door swung open and remained open. The grille was withdrawn, and a huge dark figure was framed in the glow of torches outside. The figure glided in, pulling the grille partly to behind it, leaving the bolt poised. As it moved into the light of the torch over Conan's head, the king saw that it was a gigantic black man, stark naked, bearing in one hand a huge sword and in the other a bunch of keys. The black spoke in a seacoast dialect, and Conan replied. He had learned the jargon while a corsair on the coast of Kush. Long have I wished to meet you, Amra. The black gave Conan the name Amra, the lion, by which the Cimmerian had been known to the Kushites in his piratical days. The slave's woolly skull split in an animal-like grin, showing white tusks, but his eyes glinted redly in the torchlight. I have dared much for this meeting. Look, the keys to your chains. I stole them from Shukuli. What will you give me for them? He dangled the keys in front of Conan's eyes. 10,000 golden lunas, answered the king quickly, new hope surging fiercely in his breast. Not enough, cried the black, a ferocious exultation shining on his ebon countenance. Not enough for the risks I take. Zotha's pets might come out of the dark and eat me, but if Shukuli finds out I stole his keys, he'll hang me up by my, well, what will you give me? 15,000 lunas and a palace in Poitan, offered the king. Black yelled and stamped in a frenzy of barbaric gratification. More, he cried. Offer me more. What will you give me? You black dog. A red mist of fury swept across Conan's eyes. Were I free, I'd give you a broken back. Did Shukuli send you here to mock me? Shukuli knows nothing of my coming, white man, answered the black, craning his thick neck to peer into Conan's savage eyes. I know of you of old, since the days when I was a chief among a free people, before the Stygians took me and sold me into the north. Do you not remember the sack of Bombi, when your sea-wolf swarmed in, before the palace of King Ajaga, you slew a chief, and the chief fled from you. It was my brother who died. It was I who fled. I demand of you a blood price, Amra. To me, and I'll pay you your weight in gold pieces, growled Conan. The red eyes glittered, the white teeth flashed wolfishly in the torchlight. Aye, you white dog. You are all like your race, but to a black man gold can never pay for blood. The price I ask is your head. The last word was a maniacal shriek that sent the echoes shivering. Conan tensed, unconsciously straining against his shackles, in his abhorrence of dying like a sheep. Then he was frozen by a greater horror. Over the black shoulder, he saw a vague, horrific form swaying in the darkness. Zotha will never know, laughed the black fiendishly, too engrossed in his gloating triumph to take heed of anything else, too drunk with hate to know that death swayed behind his shoulder. He will not come into the vaults until the demons have torn your bones from their chains. I will have your head, Amra. He braced his knotted legs like ebon columns and swung the massive sword in both hands, its great black muscles rolling and cracking in the torchlight. And at that instant, a titanic shadow behind him darted down and out, and the wedge-shaped head smote with an impact that re-echoed down the tunnels. Not a sound came from the thick, blubbery lips that flew wide in fleeting agony. With the thud of the stroke, Conan saw the life go out of the wide black eyes, and the suddenness of a candle go out. The blow knocked the great black body clear across the corridor, and horribly, the gigantic, sinuous shape whipped around it in glistening coils that hid it from view. And the snap and splintering of bones came plainly to Conan's ears. Then something made his heart leap madly. The sword and the keys had flown from the black's hands, to crash and jangle on the stone, and the keys lay almost at the king's feet. He tried to bend them, but the chain was too short, almost suffocated by the mad pounding of his heart. He slipped one foot from its handle and gripped them with his toes. Drawing his foot up, he grasped them fiercely, barely stifling the yell of ferocious exultation that rose instinctively to his lips. An instant's fumbling with the huge locks, and he was free. He caught... Did he do the gymnast thing where he brought his leg over his head and with his foot put the key in and undid the lock? That's what it sounds like. It's a very hard mental image to picture with Arnold Schwarzenegger as Conan. Just can't see that man doing that with those thick legs. An instant's fumbling with the huge locks and he was free. He caught up the fallen sword and glared about. Only empty darkness met his eyes, into which the serpent had dragged a mangled, tattering object that only faintly resembled a human body. Conan turned to the open door. Yeah, sure, let's just have that one line right there. Why not? A few quick strides brought him to the threshold. Just... Who's the asshole who edited this? I know who the asshole is. I can check it right now. I'm indignant. Ben J.D. John. You done fucked up. That right there, you done fucked up. Moving on. A squeal of high-pitched laughter shrilled through the vaults, and the grill shot home under his very fingers. The bolt crashed down. Through the bars peered a face like a fiendishly mocking carven gargoyle. Shukli, the eunuch who had followed his stolen keys. Surely he did not, in his gloating, see the sword in the prisoner's hand. With a terrible curse, Conan struck as a cobra strikes. The great blade hissed between the bars, and Shukli's laughter broke in a death scream. The fat eunuch bent at the middle, as if bowing to his killer, and crumpled like tallow, his pudgy hands clutching vainly at his peeling entrails. Conan snarled in savage satisfaction, but he was still a prisoner. His keys were futile against the bolt, which could be worked only from the outside. His experienced touch told him the bars were hard as the sword. An attempt to hew his way to freedom would only splinter his one weapon. Yet he found dents on those adamantine bars, like the marks of incredible fangs, and wondered with an involuntary shudder what nameless monsters had so terribly assailed the barriers. Regardless, there was but one thing for him to do, and that was to seek some other outlet. Taking the torch from the niche, he set off down the corridor, sword in hand. He saw no sign of the serpent or its victim, only a great smear of blood on the stone floor. Darkness stalked on noiseless feet about him, scarcely driven back by his flickering torch. On either hand, he saw dark openings, but he kept to the main corridor, watching the floor ahead of him carefully, lest he fall into some pit. And suddenly, he heard the sound of a woman weeping piteously. Another of Sotha's victims, he thought, cursing the wizard anew, and turning aside, followed the sound down a smaller tunnel, dank and damp. The weeping grew nearer as he advanced, and lifting his torch, he made out a vague shape in the shadows. Stepping closer, he halted in sudden horror at the amorphic bulk which sprawled before him. I'll look at something real quick. The amorphic bulk which sprawled before him. Its unstable outline somewhat suggested an octopus, but its malformed tentacles were too short for its size, and its substance was a quaking, jelly-like stuff which made him physically sick to look at. From among his loathsome gelid? I don't know that word. Gelid mass reared a frog-like head, and he was frozen with nauseated horror to realize that the sound of weeping was coming from those obscene, blubbery lips. Voice changed to an abominable, high-pitched tittering as the great unstable eyes, the monstrosity rested on him, and it hedged its quaking bulk toward him. He backed away and fled up the tunnel, not trusting his sword. The creature might be composed of terrestrial matter, but it shook his very soul to look upon it, and he doubted the power of the man-made weapons to harm it. For a short distance, he heard it flopping and floundering after him, screaming with horrible laughter. The unmistakably human note in its mirth almost staggered his reason. It was exactly such laughter as he had heard bubble obscenely from the fat lips of the salacious women of Dadazar, city of wickedness, where captive girls were stripped naked on the public auction block. By what hellish arts had Sotha brought this unnatural being into life? Conan felt vaguely that he had looked on blasphemy against the eternal laws of nature. He ran toward the main corridor, but before he reached it, he crossed a sort of small square chamber where two tunnels crossed. As he reached this chamber, he was flashingly aware of some small squat bulk on the floor ahead of him. Then, before he could check his flight or swerve aside, his foot struck something yielding that squalled shrilly, and he was precipitated headlong, the torch flying from his hand and being extinguished as it struck the stone floor. Half stunned by his fall, Conan rose and groped in the darkness. His sense of direction was confused, and he was unable to decide in which direction lay the main corridor. He did not look for the torch, as he had no means of rekindling it. His groping hands found the openings of the tunnels, and he chose one at random. How long he traversed in utter darkness he never knew. But suddenly, his barbarian's instinct of near peril halted him short. It's easier to read when I have one of these cough drops, but then I feel like the way I'm talking is off, because I'm talking around that in my cheek. Anyways. He had the same feeling he had when standing on the brink of a great precipice in the darkness. Dropping to all fours, he edged forward, and presently his outflung hand encountered the edge of a well, into which the tunnel floor dropped abruptly. Off drop. That's better. Into which the tunnel floor dropped abruptly. As far down as he could reach the sides, fell away sheerly, dank and slimy to his touch. He stretched out an arm in the darkness, and could barely touch the opposite edge with the point of his sword. He could leap across it then, but there was no point in that. He had taken the wrong tunnel, and the main corridor lay somewhere behind him. Even as he thought this, he felt a faint movement on the air. A shadowy wind, rising from the well, stirred his black mane. Conan's skin crawled. He tried to tell himself that this well connected somehow with the outer world, but his instincts told him that it was a thing unnatural. He was not merely inside the hill, he was below it, far below the level of the city streets. How then could an outer wind find its way into the pits and blow up from below? A faint throbbing pulse on that ghostly wind, like drums beating far, far below. A strong shudder shook the king of Aquilonia. He rose to his feet and backed away, and as he did, something floated up out of the well. What it was, Conan did not know. He could see nothing in the darkness, but he distinctly felt a presence, an invisible and tangible intelligence which hovered malignly near him. Turning, he fled the way he had come. Far ahead, he saw a tiny red spark. He headed for it, and long before he thought to have reached it, he caromed headlong into a solid wall, and saw the spark at his feet. It was his torch, the flame extinguished, but the end a glowing coal. Carefully he took it up and blew upon it, fanning it into a flame again. He gave a sigh as the tiny blaze leaped up. He was back in the chamber where the tunnels crossed, and his sense of direction came back. He located the tunnel by which he had left the main corridor, and even as he started toward it, his torch flame flickered wildly as if blown upon by unseen lips. Again, he felt a presence, and he lifted his torch, glaring about. He saw nothing, yet he sensed somehow an invisible, bodiless thing that hovered in the air, dripping slimily and mouthing obscenities that he could not hear, but was in some instinctive way aware of. He swung viciously with his sword, and it felt as if he were cleaving cobwebs. A cold horror shook him, and he fled down the tunnel, flinging a foul burning breath on his naked back as he ran. But when he came out into the broad corridor, he was no longer aware of any presence, visible or invisible. Down it he went, momentarily expecting fanged and taloned fiends to leap at him from the darkness. The tunnels were not silent. From the bowels of the earth in all directions came sounds that did not belong in a sane world. There were titterings, squeals of demoniac mirth. Demoniac mirth, okay. Long shuddering howls, and once the unmistakable squalling laughter of a hyena ended awfully in human words of shrieking blasphemy. He had heard the pad of stealthy feet, and in the mouths of the tunnels caught glimpses of shadowy forms, monstrous and abnormal in outline. It was as if he had wandered into hell, a hell of Sotholante's making, but the shadowy things did not come into the great corridor, though he distinctly heard the greedy sucking in of slavering lips, and felt the burning glare of hungry eyes. And presently he knew why. A slithering sound behind him electrified him, and he leaped out to the darkness of a nearby tunnel, shaking out his torch. Down the corridor, the great serpent crawling, sluggish from its recent grisly meal. From his very side, something whimpered in fear and slunk away in the darkness. Evidently, the main corridor was the great snake's hunting ground, and the other monsters gave it room. I think I am going to call it here. We will pick this back up. What the hell? I don't know how I did that, but okay. Oh, what highlighting does there? Anyways, we're going to pick this back up Tuesday. Because I've been streaming for an hour now. My voice is going out from talking so much. But I hope everyone enjoyed this Conan story. It's one of all of these early ones are my favorites so far. The middle era of Conan stories after these first few, they have a lot of good stories, but they're more formulaic and they often involve weak female characters that are just kind of annoying. They don't contribute anything beyond a token female for Conan to save. It is what it is. It's a product of the times, which also was shown earlier with I forget his name, the black guy that came to kill Conan in the cell. Which is one of the things that, along with the cosmic horror, you can tell how Robert E. Howard was great friends with Lovecraft. It seems like all of the evil things in the world have black skin in the Conan stories, which is a odd through line through all of the Conan stories. But again, it's just the product of the times, unfortunately. But the stories all still great on their own. They are just fun adventure. Not great literature, but just fun. It's strong man having an adventure. swinging his big sword around, as he do. But anyways, I will be back tomorrow at 1:30 Eastern. I'm gonna play some video, or I might do some ward building. I'm not quite sure yet, because I'm still deciding what video game I will play next. Because I enjoyed Starship Troopers, but it's hard for me to think and talk while playing an RTS, I found. So I'll probably either do a game that's new to me, so I have a new experience to share, or it may be a first-person shooter that's easier for me to talk while I'm just going through it. But I hope everyone has a fantastic Wednesday. I will see you all tomorrow night.